My name is Brenda Lawson, and I'm 76 years old. When I look back at my life, I see a tapestry woven with threads of joy, sorrow, triumph, and heartbreak. Born in 1949 in a small apartment above my grandmother's bakery in Boston, I never imagined the journey that lay ahead of me. They say life is what happens while you're busy making other plans, and I've learned that truth intimately. From the moment I took my first breath on a cold February morning to this very day, sitting in my cozy kitchen surrounded by the aroma of fresh-baked cookies, my story has been one of resilience, love, and the power of simple pleasures. I've been a daughter, a student, a dreamer, a wife, a mother, a widow, and through it all, a woman who found her calling in the most unexpected place, the kitchen. My hands have kneaded thousands of loaves of bread, stirred countless pots of soup, and wiped away more tears than I can count. But they've also created comfort, spread joy, and built bridges between hearts through the universal language of food. The defining moment of my life came when I was just 14 years old, standing in front of a panel of judges at the Boston Youth Culinary Championship. That day changed everything. It set me on a path I never could have imagined, leading me through decades of feeding hungry souls, not just their bodies, but their spirits too. But my story isn't just about cooking. It's about loss and love, about finding purpose in service, about the way small acts of kindness can ripple through generations. It's about learning that sometimes the most extraordinary lives are built from the most ordinary moments. So pull up a chair, pour yourself a cup of coffee, and let me tell you about a life that's been both beautifully simple and profoundly meaningful. And if my story touches your heart, I hope you'll share it with someone who might need to hear that every life has value, every dream has worth, and it's never too late to make a difference. I came into this world on February 14th, 1949, Valentine's Day. A fitting birthday for someone who would spend her life spreading love through food. My mother, Mary O'Sullivan, was just 19 when she had me, unmarried and scared in a time when that meant shame and whispers. But my grandmother, Agnes O'Sullivan, had different plans. Grandma Agnes ran O'Sullivan's Bakery on Hanover Street in Boston's North End. She was a formidable Irish woman who stood barely 5 feet tall but commanded respect from everyone who knew her. When my mother came home pregnant, Grandma simply said, "Babies are blessings, not burdens," and that was the end of the discussion. I grew up in that bakery, sleeping in a crib next to the ovens, crawling between flour sacks, and learning to walk on floors dusted with powdered sugar. The bakery was my playground, my classroom, and my first glimpse into the magic of creating something beautiful from simple ingredients. My earliest memories are filled with the sounds of that place, the gentle whoosh of the oven's opening, the rhythmic thud of dough being kneaded, the cheerful chatter of customers starting their day with fresh bread and pastries. Grandma would lift me onto a wooden crate so I could see over the counter, and I'd watch in wonder as she transformed flour, butter, and sugar into works of art. By the time I was 5, I could crack eggs without getting shells in the bowl. By 7, I was measuring ingredients and learning the feel of properly mixed batter. Grandma taught me that baking wasn't just about following recipes. It was about understanding how ingredients talk to each other, how temperature and timing could make the difference between perfection and disappointment. My mother worked as a seamstress in a factory across town, leaving before dawn and returning after dark. She was loving but distant, carrying the weight of her choices like a heavy coat she couldn't take off. It was Grandma who raised me, who taught me that food was love made visible, who showed me that feeding people was one of the highest forms of service. School was difficult for me. I was shy and self-conscious about my family situation. Other kids had fathers who came to school plays and mothers who packed fancy lunches. I had Grandma's day-old pastries wrapped in wax paper and questions I couldn't answer about where my daddy was. But in the bakery, I was confident, capable, and needed. When I turned 10, Grandma started teaching me the family recipes that had been passed down through generations. She made me memorize them, not write them down, because recipes live in your hands and heart, not on paper. I learned to make her famous Irish soda bread, her delicate butter cookies, and her apple tarts that drew lines around the block every autumn. Those early years shaped everything about who I would become. In that warm, flower-dusted sanctuary, I learned that food could heal hearts, build communities, and create memories that lasted lifetimes. I didn't know it then, but I was already becoming the person I was meant to be, someone who would spend her life nourishing others. The year I turned 14 was when everything changed. It was 1963, and Boston was buzzing with change. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum, President Kennedy was in the White House, and there was an electricity in the air that made everything seem possible, even for a shy bakery girl from the North End. Grandma had been talking about the Boston Youth Culinary Championship for weeks. It was a new competition, the first of its kind, designed to encourage young people to pursue careers in food service. The winner would receive a $500 scholarship and recognition in the Boston Globe. To a working-class family like ours, $500 was a fortune, nearly 3 months' worth of grocery money. "You should enter, Brenda," Grandma said one morning as we prepared the day's bread. "You've got hands blessed by the angels themselves." I laughed nervously. "Grandma, I'm just a kid. Those other contestants probably go to fancy cooking schools." But Grandma had that look in her eyes, the one that meant she'd already made up her mind. "Fancy schools don't teach what you know, child. They don't teach love." The application required me to submit 3 recipes and explain why I wanted to pursue culinary arts. Sitting at the small table in our apartment above the bakery, I struggled with what to write. How could I explain that cooking wasn't something I wanted to do? It was something I had to do, like breathing or sleeping. How could I put into words the way I felt when I saw someone's face light up after tasting something I'd made? I decided to submit Grandma's apple tart recipe, my own version of chocolate chip cookies that included a secret ingredient of cinnamon and a touch of sea salt, and what I called comfort soup, a hearty vegetable and bean soup that we made for neighbors when someone was sick or grieving. The day of the competition arrived gray and drizzly, typical March weather in Boston. The contest was held at the Copley Plaza Hotel, the fanciest place I'd ever set foot in. The marble floors and crystal chandeliers made me feel small and out of place. There were 24 contestants, and I was definitely the youngest and most plainly dressed. The other kids had matching aprons and professional-looking knife sets. I had Grandma's old apron, which she'd insisted I wear for luck, and a cloth bag containing my grandmother's wooden spoons and measuring cups. Some contestants had parents hovering nearby with cameras. I had taken the bus alone, too proud to ask my mother to take time off work. The challenge was to prepare a 3-course meal in 2 hours using a mystery basket of ingredients. When they revealed the basket, my heart sank. There were ingredients I'd never worked with before: duck breast, exotic mushrooms, unfamiliar herbs. But then I saw the potatoes, onions, apples, and cream, and suddenly I knew what to do. Instead of trying to cook something fancy and unfamiliar, I decided to create elevated versions of comfort foods. I made a duck and potato soup with herbs, pan-seared the remaining duck breast with an apple and onion compote, and for dessert, I created individual apple tarts with a cream sauce infused with the exotic mushrooms, which turned out to have an earthy sweetness that complemented the apples perfectly. As I cooked, something magical happened. The nervousness melted away, and I felt like I was back in Grandma's kitchen. My hands moved with confidence, and I could hear her voice guiding me. "Trust your instincts, child." The food will tell you what it needs. When time was called, I looked at my 3 dishes and felt proud. They weren't the most sophisticated presentations, but they were honest, delicious, and made with love. The judging seemed to take forever. When they called my name as the winner, I thought I'd misheard. The head judge, a chef from one of Boston's finest restaurants, explained their decision. Miss Lawson's dishes showed technical skill, but more importantly, they showed soul. She took unfamiliar ingredients and made them feel like home. That night, with the $500 check in my hand and my picture scheduled for the Sunday paper, I knew my life would never be the same. I had found my calling, and more importantly, I had found my confidence. The victory at the Culinary Championship opened doors I never knew existed, but it also marked the beginning of one of the most challenging periods of my life. The scholarship money was earmarked for culinary school, but life had other plans for our family. 3 months after my win, Grandma Agnes started having what she called dizzy spells. She'd be kneading dough one moment and gripping the counter for support the next, her face pale and drawn. Being the stubborn Irish woman she was, she refused to see a doctor, insisting it was just the heat from the ovens or too much coffee. It was a busy Saturday morning in July when everything changed. I was helping serve customers when I heard a crash from the kitchen. I found Grandma on the floor, flour scattered around her like snow, her body still and frighteningly small. The doctors at Massachusetts General Hospital delivered the news with clinical efficiency. A massive stroke had stolen away much of the woman who had raised me. Grandma survived, but the vibrant, commanding presence I'd known was gone. She couldn't speak clearly, couldn't use her right side, and most heartbreakingly, couldn't remember the recipes that had been her life's work. The bakery, our family's livelihood for 30 years, had to be sold to pay for her medical care. My mother, overwhelmed by caring for both Grandma and maintaining our family, made the decision to move us to a smaller apartment in Dorchester. I had to leave my friends, my neighborhood, and most painfully, the kitchen where I'd learned to love cooking. The scholarship money, which should have been my ticket to culinary school, went to help support our family through this crisis. I started high school feeling lost and angry. While other kids my age were worried about homework and school dances, I was learning to feed my grandmother through a straw and watching my mother work 2 jobs to keep us afloat. The confident young chef who had won that competition seemed like a different person entirely. But if there's one thing Grandma had taught me, it was that life's challenges are just ingredients. It's what you do with them that matters. I started cooking again, not in a professional kitchen with fancy equipment, but on a hot plate in our tiny apartment. I made simple, nutritious meals that Grandma could manage, and I discovered that cooking for someone you love, even in the humblest circumstances, can be the most meaningful cooking of all. I got a part-time job at a local diner after school, washing dishes and occasionally helping with food prep. The owner, Mr. Kowalski, was a gruff Polish immigrant who ran the place with military precision. He didn't care about my culinary championship or my dreams. He cared about whether I could keep up with the demands of a working kitchen. It was brutal work. My hands were constantly burned and cut, my feet ached from standing on concrete floors, and I smelled like grease and coffee no matter how much I showered. But I was learning something they didn't teach in culinary schools. I was learning about the real world of food service, where speed mattered as much as skill, and where feeding working people honest food was its own form of art. One evening, when the dinner rush was particularly hectic, the short-order cook called in sick. Mr. Kowalski looked at me with desperation and said, "You know how to cook, right? The contest kid." For the next 4 hours, I cooked for a packed diner. Burgers, fries, meatloaf, mashed potatoes, apple pie. Nothing fancy, nothing innovative, just good, solid food for people who needed fuel for their bodies and comfort for their souls. When the last customer left, and I was cleaning the grill, Mr. Kowalski handed me an extra $20. "You did good tonight, kid," he said. "Real good. You want to learn this business? This is where you start, not with ribbons and fancy schools, but with hungry people who need feeding." That night, walking home through the dark streets of Dorchester, I realized that losing the bakery and the scholarship hadn't derailed my dreams. It had just redirected them towards something more real, more necessary, and ultimately more meaningful. The summer I turned 17, everything changed again, but this time it was because of a boy with the kindest brown eyes I'd ever seen, and a smile that could light up the darkest room. His name was James Lawson, and he walked into Mr. Kowalski's diner on a humid July evening, wearing his Army uniform and looking like he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. James was 21, home on leave from Fort Bragg before shipping out to Vietnam. He ordered coffee and apple pie, and when I served him, he looked up at me and said, "Did you make this pie? Because it tastes like my grandmother's, and she's been gone for 10 years. That simple compliment started a conversation that lasted until Mr. Kowalski kicked us out at closing time. James had grown up in Roxbury, lost his parents in a car accident when he was 16, and joined the Army because he had nowhere else to go. We were both young people who had learned too early that life could be unpredictable and sometimes cruel. We had exactly 3 weeks together before he had to report back. 3 weeks of stolen moments between my shifts at the diner, walks along the Charles River, and late-night conversations about dreams we put on hold. He told me about his plans to become a mechanic when his service was done. I told him about my culinary championship and my hopes of someday opening a restaurant. "When I get back," he said on our last night together, "I want to try everything you can cook. I want to be your best customer." The morning he left, standing on the platform at South Station with tears streaming down my face, James took my hands and made me a promise. "I'm coming back, Brenda. And when I do, if you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my life eating your cooking." For the next 18 months, we wrote letters almost every day. His came on thin military paper, smelling faintly of dust and diesel fuel, filled with descriptions of places I could barely pronounce, and a longing for home that broke my heart. Mine were filled with news from the diner, stories about Grandma's slow recovery, and detailed descriptions of every meal I cooked, trying to bring him the comfort of familiar flavors across thousands of miles. I graduated from high school that year, third in my class despite everything. My guidance counselor tried to convince me to apply to colleges, but I knew that wasn't my path. My family needed me, and honestly, I needed them too. Instead of leaving for college, I took a full-time position at the diner and started taking night classes in business administration at Roxbury Community College. The plan was simple: learn the business side of food service while honing my cooking skills, save money, and when James came home, we'd start our life together. Maybe open a small restaurant, nothing fancy, just a place where working people could get good food at fair prices. But war has its own plans, and they rarely align with the dreams of young people in love. The telegram came on a Tuesday morning in November 1968. I was making coffee for the breakfast rush when Mr. Kowalski called me to the front of the diner. There was a military officer standing there, his face grave and professional. Before he even spoke, I knew. James had been killed in action near Saigon, 3 weeks before he was supposed to come home. 3 weeks before we were going to start our lives together. 22 years old, and all his dreams and plans were gone in an instant. The funeral was small, just me, a few neighbors from his old building, and his Army buddies who were home on leave. I stood in that cemetery in my black dress, holding the folded flag they'd given me, and felt like I was burying not just the man I loved, but the future we'd planned together. People told me I was young, that I'd love again. That time would heal the wound. They meant well, but they didn't understand. James hadn't just been my boyfriend. He'd been my partner in dreaming, my motivation for building something better, my proof that love could survive the hardest circumstances. I kept working at the diner, kept taking care of Grandma, kept moving through the motions of living. But inside, I felt like I was sleepwalking through a life that was supposed to be different, supposed to be shared, supposed to be full of the laughter and dreams that died with James in a jungle on the other side of the world. The years following James's death were a blur of routine and quiet grief. I worked at the diner, took care of Grandma, and existed in a gray space between living and merely surviving. It was 1971 when Mrs. Catherine Murphy, the head of food services for Boston Public Schools, walked into Mr. Kowalski's diner and unknowingly changed the course of my life. Mrs. Murphy was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd been feeding Boston's children for nearly 20 years. She ordered coffee and a slice of meatloaf, and I served her the same way I served everyone, with quiet efficiency and a small smile. But something made her linger that day. Maybe the way I'd warmed the plate before serving, or the fact that I'd added a small garnish of parsley to brighten the presentation. "You take pride in your work," she said as I refilled her coffee. "That's rare in food service these days." We struck up a conversation, and when she learned about my culinary background and business classes, she mentioned that the school district was looking for kitchen staff who could do more than just heat up pre-made meals. The federal government had just started the National School Lunch Program expansion, and Boston was committed to serving real, nutritious food to its children. "Would you be interested in working with kids?" she asked. "Because I think you might be exactly what we need." The Boston school system in 1971 was facing massive changes. Court-ordered desegregation was creating tension throughout the city, and many children were arriving at school as the only stable, safe place in their daily lives. Mrs. Murphy explained that the food service program was about more than just feeding kids. It was about providing comfort, consistency, and sometimes the only nutritious meal a child would get that day. My first assignment was at the William Monroe Trotter Elementary School in Roxbury, a predominantly black school in one of the city's most challenging neighborhoods. The kitchen was small, the equipment was old, and the budget was tight, but the need was enormous. Many of these children qualified for free lunch, and for some, the breakfast and lunch we served were the only reliable meals they had. I started as a cook, but quickly found myself doing much more. I learned the names of the regular kids, noticed who wasn't eating well, and began adapting recipes to make them more appealing to young palates. When I saw kids throwing away the vegetables, I started cutting them smaller and mixing them into sauces. When I noticed some children were too shy to ask for seconds, I started walking through the lunchroom with extra portions. One day, I noticed a second grader named Marcus who would come through the lunch line, but barely eat anything on his tray. He was thin, quiet, and always seemed tired. After watching this pattern for weeks, I gently asked him if the food was okay. "It's fine, Miss Brenda," he said softly. "I'm just not very hungry." But I could see he was hungry. I could see it in the way he watched other kids eat, in the way his eyes followed the food. Something else was going on. After talking with his teacher, I learned that Marcus's grandmother, who was raising him, had instilled in him the belief that he should only eat if there was enough for everyone else first. Even at 7 years old, he was trying to take care of others. From that day forward, I made sure Marcus knew that there was always enough, that his job as a student was to eat well, so he could learn and grow. I started packing extra fruit or crackers for him to take home, telling him it was extras that would just go to waste otherwise. Slowly, he began to trust that there really was enough, and I watched him blossom into a more confident, energetic child. Stories like Marcus's became my motivation. I realized that my role in that school kitchen was about much more than following recipes and managing food costs. I was part of a network of adults who were committed to nurturing these children, to giving them the foundation they needed to succeed. When the busing crisis erupted in 1974, bringing violent protests and scared children from all over the city into unfamiliar schools, the cafeteria became a refuge of normalcy. Kids who couldn't communicate because of fear or language barriers could still understand kindness served with a meal. I learned to cook foods that would comfort children from Irish, Italian, Black, and Puerto Rican families, finding the common threads in human hunger and the universal language of care. By my third year at Trotter, I had been promoted to head cook, and I started training other staff not just in food preparation, but in recognizing the signs that a child might need extra attention. We became informal counselors, surrogate grandmothers, and sometimes the most consistent adults in a child's life. The work was exhausting and often heartbreaking, but it gave me something I hadn't felt since James died: a sense of purpose. Every day, I was making a difference in the lives of children who needed what I had to offer. In feeding them, I found that I was feeding something in myself that had been hungry for years. By 1978, I had found my calling in the Boston public schools, but my life was about to expand in ways I never expected. It started with a conversation after Sunday service at St. Augustine's Catholic Church, where I'd been attending since moving to Dorchester. Father O'Brien approached me after Mass with a request that would become the beginning of my deepest community involvement. "Brenda," he said, his Irish accent still thick after 30 years in Boston, "we're starting a soup kitchen for the homeless and hungry. Mrs. Patterson tells me you're quite the cook at the school. Would you consider helping us get started?" The idea both excited and terrified me. Cooking for children was one thing. They were forgiving, appreciative, and their needs were predictable. But cooking for adults facing homelessness, addiction, and mental illness? That seemed like an entirely different challenge. The church basement was drafty and poorly equipped, with just 2 gas burners, a handful of donated pots, and a refrigerator that worked only when it felt like it. Our first meal was supposed to serve 50 people, but we had ingredients donated haphazardly: cases of canned corn, day-old bread from 3 different bakeries, and a massive ham that someone's family couldn't finish. I arrived that first Saturday morning with no real plan except to feed whoever showed up. By 11 a.m., there was a line stretching around the block, not 50 people, but nearly 200, men and women of all ages, some clearly struggling with addiction, others who looked like they'd simply fallen on hard times, families with children who reminded me of my students. What struck me most was their dignity. Despite their circumstances, they waited patiently in line, thanked us quietly, and treated each other with respect. An elderly man named William, who I later learned had been a jazz musician before alcohol took his career, helped serve meals even though he was hungry himself. A young mother named Sarah kept her 2 small children close, but made sure other people went ahead of them in line. That first meal was organized chaos. We ran out of plates and used paper cups, ran out of spoons, and told people to drink their soup. But we fed everyone. And when the last person had eaten, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the deep satisfaction of having met a genuine need. The soup kitchen became my Saturday routine, then my passion project. I started planning menus, organizing volunteers, and learning about nutrition for people whose bodies were compromised by poor living conditions and limited access to health care. I discovered that cooking for the homeless required different skills than cooking for children: heartier portions, foods that would provide lasting energy, meals that restored dignity along with nutrition. One regular visitor was a Vietnam veteran named Robert, who rarely spoke but always helped clean up after meals. One day, as we were washing dishes together, he quietly said, "Thank you for treating us like people, not problems." That comment made me realize something important. The food was just the beginning. What these men and women needed was to be seen, to be valued, to be reminded that they mattered. Our little soup kitchen became a place where people could sit down at a table, eat a warm meal with dignity, and for an hour or two, feel like they belonged somewhere. Word spread through the community, and soon other churches were asking for help starting their own programs. I began training volunteers not just in food safety and preparation, but in the art of serving with dignity. Look people in the eye, I would tell new volunteers. Learn their names if they'll tell you. Remember that every person in line has a story, and most of those stories include loss and pain you can't imagine. The soup kitchen also introduced me to the broader network of social services in Boston. I learned about housing programs, job training initiatives, and addiction recovery resources. I started keeping a list of phone numbers and addresses, turning our serving line into an informal information center where people could learn about help that was available to them. By 1982, our little church basement operation was serving over 400 meals every Saturday, and I had helped establish similar programs at 6 other churches throughout the city. The work was entirely voluntary. I still had my day job in the school system, but it had become central to my identity and purpose. More importantly, it had connected me to a community of people who shared my belief that everyone deserves to eat with dignity. The volunteers who showed up every Saturday became some of my closest friends, people from all walks of life who were united by a simple desire to help their neighbors. In serving others, we had created our own family, our own sense of belonging. In 1985, at the age of 36, I had settled into what I thought would be the pattern of my life: my job at the schools, my volunteer work at the soup kitchen, and quiet evenings taking care of Grandma Agnes, whose condition had stabilized but left her needing constant care. I had made peace with being alone, or so I thought, until the day Sharon Mitchell walked into my life and changed everything. Sharon was a new teacher at Trotter Elementary, fresh out of Boston University with idealistic dreams about changing the world through education. She was 24, energetic, and had a way of talking to the children that reminded me of the best teachers I'd known. More importantly for our friendship, she was fascinated by the school lunch program and kept asking me questions about nutrition, food costs, and how to help kids who weren't eating well. What started as professional conversations over coffee in the teachers' lounge grew into a genuine friendship. Sharon was going through her own struggles, student loans, a tiny apartment, and the overwhelming realization that teaching was harder than she'd expected. I found myself inviting her for dinner, sharing recipes, and offering the kind of maternal support that seemed to flow naturally between us. "You know," she said one evening as we cleaned dishes after a meal I'd cooked, "I always wondered what it would be like to have an older sister. Now I know." That comment hit me harder than I expected. I'd spent so many years focused on caring for others, Grandma, my students, the people at the soup kitchen, that I'd forgotten how good it felt to have someone care about me too. Sharon worried when I worked too hard, celebrated my small victories, and listened patiently when I needed to talk about James or the dreams I'd given up. Our friendship deepened when Sharon started volunteering at the soup kitchen. She had a gift for connecting with people, especially the younger men and women who reminded her of students she taught. She started bringing books to the soup kitchen, creating an informal lending library, and even began offering basic literacy tutoring to anyone who was interested. In 1987, Sharon got married to David, a kind man who worked as a social worker, and I worried that our friendship would fade as her life took on new priorities. Instead, David embraced the extended family we'd created, often joining us at the soup kitchen and becoming one of our most reliable volunteers. When Sharon got pregnant in 1989, she asked me to be the baby's godmother. Standing in the church during little Emily's baptism, holding this perfect child and promising to help guide her spiritual development, I felt a completeness I'd never experienced before. I had always thought family was something you were born into or married into, but Sharon had taught me that sometimes the most important families are the ones you choose. Emily became the grandchild I'd never expected to have. I taught her to crack eggs without getting shells in the bowl, just as Grandma had taught me. I made her birthday cakes from scratch, packed special lunches for her school field trips, and listened to her stories about friends and dreams and all the important things that fill a child's world. When Sharon and David's second child, Michael, was born in 1992, my role in their family was firmly established. I was Auntie Brenda, the woman who always had cookies in her purse, who knew exactly what to cook when someone was sick, and who could be counted on for babysitting, school pickups, and all the countless small acts of care that make family life work. But the gift wasn't one-sided. Having Sharon's family in my life gave me something to celebrate, something to plan for, people to worry about in the way you worry about your own children. When Emily had nightmares, she called me. When Michael learned to ride a bike, I was there cheering. When Sharon struggled with balancing work and motherhood, we figured it out together. By the mid-1990s, our chosen family had expanded to include several of the teachers from school, some of the regular volunteers from the soup kitchen, and neighbors who had become friends through years of shared meals and celebrations. We gathered for holidays, supported each other through difficulties, and created the kind of community that I'd always craved but never known how to build. Looking back, I realized that the family I created was more intentional and perhaps more loving than many biological families. We chose each other, committed to each other, and worked to maintain our connections through all the changes life brought our way. By 1995, I had been working in the Boston public school system for over 20 years, and the children I'd served in my early days were now having children of their own. Some would stop by the school to introduce me to their babies, telling them, "This is Miss Brenda. She made sure I ate good food when I was little." Those moments reminded me why I'd chosen this path and how food could be a thread connecting generations. At 56, I was considered a veteran in the school system, and younger staff members often came to me for advice about everything from difficult children to budget management. I'd become something I'd never expected to be: a mentor, a keeper of institutional knowledge, and, according to one principal, the heart and soul of our school community. The work had evolved over the years. Federal nutrition guidelines had become stricter, requiring more fresh fruits and vegetables and less processed food. I welcomed these changes, even though they made my job more complex. I started a small garden behind the school, where students could help grow herbs and vegetables that we used in our meals. Watching third graders get excited about eating salad made from lettuce they'd planted themselves was one of the great joys of my later career. Around this time, Emily, Sharon's daughter, who was now 6 years old, started asking to spend summers with me. What began as occasional day visits evolved into Emily becoming my constant companion during her school breaks. She would help me at the soup kitchen, learning to treat everyone with respect and dignity. At the school, she became my unofficial assistant, helping distribute napkins and fruit to the younger children. "Why do you like working here so much, Auntie Brenda?" Emily asked one day as we prepared vegetables for the next day's meal. I thought about her question carefully, because every day I get to help children grow strong and healthy. And when you help children, you're helping the whole future. Emily nodded seriously, then said, "When I grow up, I want to help children too, but maybe as a teacher like my mom." Those conversations with Emily made me reflect on my own legacy. I'd never had children of my own, but I'd fed thousands of children over the years. I'd never opened my own restaurant, but I'd created something more important: a place where food served a higher purpose than profit. In 1998, The school district honored me with their Outstanding Service Award, recognizing my 27 years of dedication to feeding Boston's children. The ceremony was held at the Copley Plaza Hotel, the same place where I'd won the culinary championship as a 14-year-old girl. Standing on that stage, accepting recognition for a career I'd never planned but had grown to love, I thought about Grandma Agnes and how proud she would have been. The real recognition came in smaller moments, though. Like the day Marcus, the shy second grader I'd worried about years earlier, returned as a 25-year-old man with his own son. He'd become a teacher himself and wanted to thank me for showing him that there was always enough food, enough care, enough hope to go around. As the millennium approached, talk began circulating about budget cuts and changes to the food service program. There was pressure to switch to pre-packaged meals, to reduce staff, to prioritize efficiency over quality. At 60, I could have quietly retired and avoided the battles ahead, but I wasn't ready to stop fighting for what I believed in. The children still needed advocates, still deserved fresh, nutritious meals prepared with care. I decided to stay and fight for what I'd spent my career building. Those transition years between 1999 and 2003 were challenging, but also deeply rewarding. I worked with nutritionists, administrators, and parent groups to develop menus that met new federal guidelines while still appealing to young palates. I trained a new generation of kitchen staff in both food safety and the philosophy of serving with love. More importantly, I began documenting everything I'd learned over the years. I wrote detailed recipes scaled for large groups, created training manuals for new staff, and compiled a guide for recognizing children who might need extra attention or support. I wanted to ensure that the institutional knowledge I'd gained wouldn't leave with me. The soup kitchen work continued to be central to my life, even as age made the long Saturday shifts more tiring. By 2000, we were serving over 600 meals each week and had expanded to include a clothing distribution program and basic health screenings provided by volunteer nurses. One of my proudest achievements during this period was convincing the school district to donate surplus food to the soup kitchen program. Instead of throwing away perfectly good food that exceeded daily requirements, we created a system where schools could contribute to feeding the broader community. It seemed like such an obvious solution, but it took 3 years of meetings and paperwork to make it happen. As Emily grew older, now a teenager with her own activities and interests, our relationship evolved from caregiver and child to something more like grandmother and granddaughter. She would still help at the soup kitchen when she could, but now she brought friends with her, creating a new generation of young volunteers who understood the importance of community service. Today, at 76, I sit in my small apartment in Dorchester, surrounded by photographs that tell the story of a life I never expected to live. There are pictures from the culinary championship that started it all, wedding photos of Sharon and David, countless images of Emily and Michael growing up, and snapshots from decades of soup kitchen volunteers who became family. My hands are weathered now, marked by thousands of hours in hot kitchens, but they're steady enough to still knead dough and chop vegetables. I volunteer twice a week at a community center, teaching cooking classes to young parents who want to provide nutritious meals on tight budgets. The techniques are the same ones Grandma Agnes taught me in her bakery 70 years ago. It's all about understanding your ingredients and cooking with love. Looking back, I realized that losing the scholarship money to culinary school wasn't a setback. It was a redirection towards something more meaningful than I could have imagined. Instead of cooking for people who could afford fine dining, I spent my life feeding those who needed nourishment most. Instead of building a business, I built a community. Instead of achieving fame, I achieved something better. The knowledge that I made a difference in the lives of people who needed what I had to offer. The teenage girl who won that cooking contest dreamed of opening a fancy restaurant and seeing her name in lights. The woman I became learned that there are many ways to feed people, and the most important ingredient in any meal is the love you put into it. Every child who left my cafeteria with a full belly, every person who found dignity at our soup kitchen table, every volunteer who discovered the joy of service, they were all part of a recipe for a life well lived. I never married, never had children of my own, never traveled to exotic places or achieved conventional success. But I loved deeply, served faithfully, and created a legacy of care that will continue long after I'm gone. The children I fed became parents who understood the importance of nutrition. The volunteers I trained started their own service programs. The love multiplied and spread in ways I'll never fully know. If you take anything from my story, let it be this: every act of service, no matter how small, matters. Every meal prepared with care, every person treated with dignity, every moment you choose to put others' needs alongside your own, these are the ingredients of a meaningful life. You don't need fame or fortune to make a difference. You just need to see the hunger around you and decide to do something about it. The greatest recipe I ever learned wasn't written in any cookbook. It was simple. Take whatever you have, add love, and share it generously. That's how you feed not just bodies, but souls. That's how you build a life that nourishes the world.